Maria Santos never imagined that her steady hands, trained to cut and style hair in a small village salon, would one day steady a rifle to save the lives of America's most elite soldiers. She was just a 34-year-old single mother trying to make ends meet in the mountains of Afghanistan, where her modest beauty parlor served local women seeking a moment of normalcy in a war-torn land. But on one scorching afternoon in June 2019, as she swept hair from her salon floor, the distant sound of helicopter rotors would shatter her quiet world forever. Within hours, this ordinary woman would find herself face to face with captured Navy SEALs, surrounded by 52 heavily armed enemy fighters, and forced to make a choice that would either save lives or cost her everything she held dear. This is the true story of how a simple hairdresser became an unlikely hero in one of the most intense rescue operations never reported in mainstream media. A story of courage, quick thinking, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people when pushed to their limits. Maria Santos had always believed that life was about finding small pockets of beauty in a harsh world. Every morning at sunrise, she would unlock the wooden door of her tiny salon in the village of Khost, Afghanistan, and transform a simple room into a sanctuary where local women could forget, even briefly, about the constant threat of violence that shadowed their daily lives. The salon was nothing fancy, just 4 mismatched chairs, a cracked mirror she had salvaged from a bombed building, and a collection of scissors and combs that she had carefully maintained for over a decade. The walls were painted a soft yellow, a color she had chosen because it reminded her of the sunflowers that once grew in her grandmother's garden back when Afghanistan was a different place, before the wars and the endless cycle of occupation and resistance. Maria's hands were her greatest asset. They moved with the precision of a surgeon and the gentleness of a mother. Whether she was braiding a young bride's hair for her wedding or giving an elderly woman a trim that would make her feel dignified again. Her customers often said that Maria's touch could heal more than just damaged hair. It could restore a piece of their humanity that the conflict had tried to steal away. She had learned her trade from her mother, who had operated a similar salon in Kabul before the family was forced to flee to the remote mountain village during the Taliban's first rise to power. Maria was only 8 years old then, but she had watched her mother carefully, memorizing every technique, every gentle stroke of the brush, every way to make a woman feel beautiful, despite the mandatory coverings that hid most of her appearance from the outside world. By the time Maria was 16, she was already helping her mother with customers. By 20, she had taken over the business entirely after her mother died from an illness they couldn't afford to treat properly. By 25, she had married Ahmad, a local mechanic, who fixed generators and water pumps for the village. Their life together was simple but filled with genuine affection and shared dreams of eventually saving enough money to move somewhere safer, maybe to Pakistan or even Europe if they were extremely fortunate. Those dreams died along with Ahmad when an improvised explosive device detonated near the market where he was buying parts for a broken water pump. Maria was 28 years old, 6 months pregnant, and suddenly completely alone in a world that offered few opportunities for widowed women to support themselves. But Maria was not the type to surrender to despair. She channeled her grief into determination, working longer hours in the salon and gradually building a reputation that extended beyond her immediate village. Women would travel for hours on foot or by donkey to reach her, bringing stories of their own struggles and leaving with renewed confidence and carefully styled hair that made them feel human again. Her daughter, Layla, became the center of Maria's universe. Every sacrifice, every long day standing on aching feet, every risk she took by operating a business that some of the more conservative elements in the region viewed with suspicion, it was all for Layla. The little girl, now 6 years old, would spend her afternoons in the salon doing homework or playing quietly in the corner while Maria worked. The salon had become more than just a business. It was a community hub where women could speak freely about their concerns, share news about their families, and support each other through the countless challenges of daily life in a conflict zone. Maria had carefully cultivated relationships with wives of local leaders, which provided her with a measure of protection and legitimacy that kept her business running even during the most unstable periods. She had also developed an unusual skill set beyond hairdressing. Living in a region where danger was constant had taught her to read people quickly and accurately. She could sense tension in accustomed shoulders that had nothing to do with a bad haircut, detect fear in someone's voice that suggested real threats rather than ordinary worries, and most importantly, she had learned to trust her instincts about when something was seriously wrong. The village of Khost sat in a strategically important valley that had seen decades of conflict. Soviet forces had fought here in the 1980s, followed by various Mujahideen factions, then the Taliban, and now American and NATO forces, along with Afghan government troops. The population had learned to be adaptable, to keep their heads down during firefights, to help each other during the quiet periods, and to ask very few questions about the armed men who occasionally passed through, regardless of which side they claimed to represent. Maria understood these unwritten rules perfectly. She served customers regardless of their political affiliations or the allegiances of their husbands and brothers. A Taliban commander's wife received the same quality service as the spouse of an Afghan National Army officer. This neutrality wasn't just good business. It was essential survival strategy in a place where picking the wrong side could get you and your family killed. The American presence in the region had been a complex reality for most of Maria's adult life. Unlike many of her neighbors, she held no strong political opinions about the occupation. She had seen enough violence and instability to know that every group of armed men, regardless of their stated intentions, brought both benefits and dangers to ordinary civilians. The Americans provided security that allowed her business to operate more freely than it had during Taliban control, but they also attracted attacks that put everyone in the crossfire. What Maria did appreciate about the American presence was the small improvements it had brought to daily life. There was better access to medical supplies, the roads were somewhat safer during daylight hours, and international aid organizations had improved access to clean water and basic education. For a mother raising a daughter alone, these practical benefits outweighed abstract political considerations. She had encountered American soldiers a few times over the years, usually during routine patrols through the village, or when they set up temporary checkpoints. Most of them were polite but distant, clearly aware that their presence made civilians nervous. Some of the younger soldiers would wave to Layla when they saw her playing outside the salon, and Maria appreciated their attempts to appear friendly rather than threatening. But Maria's world remained fundamentally separate from the military conflict swirling around her. Her concerns were immediate and practical: keeping her daughter healthy and safe, maintaining enough income to pay for food and rent, building relationships with customers who would continue to trust her with their appearance and their secrets, and staying alert to the subtle changes in village dynamics that might signal approaching trouble. The salon represented everything Maria had managed to build from the ashes of personal tragedy. It was proof that even in the most challenging circumstances, a person could create something valuable and meaningful. Every satisfied customer who left feeling more confident was a small victory against the forces that tried to grind down the human spirit. Every laugh that echoed off the yellow walls was an act of defiance against those who believed that ordinary people had no right to moments of joy and beauty. As June 2019 began, Maria felt cautiously optimistic about her future. Layla was doing well in school, the salon was busy enough to provide financial stability, and the security situation in their immediate area had been relatively calm for several months. She had even started putting aside small amounts of money toward her old dream of eventual relocation to somewhere safer, though she knew it would take years to save enough for such a dramatic move. The routines of daily life had created a comforting rhythm. Each morning, Maria would prepare Layla for school, open the salon, and begin the day's work with whatever appointments were scheduled. Afternoons often brought walk-in customers or women who simply wanted to sit and talk while their friends received treatment. Evenings were for family time, helping Layla with homework, preparing simple meals, and occasionally sharing tea with neighbors on the small patio behind their modest home. These ordinary rhythms were about to be shattered forever. But on the morning of June 15th, as Maria swept the salon floor and prepared for what she expected to be another routine day, she had no way of knowing that her life was about to intersect with international military operations in ways that would test every skill she had developed and every ounce of courage she possessed. The stage was set for an extraordinary test of an ordinary woman's character. Within hours, the same hands that had spent years bringing beauty and comfort to her neighbors would be forced to make life-and-death decisions that would determine the fate of America's most elite warriors and change the course of her own existence forever. The first sign that June 15th would be different from any other day came at exactly 11:47 in the morning, when Maria heard the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors echoing off the mountain walls surrounding the valley. The sound was deeper and more sustained than the usual brief flyovers that occasionally interrupted the village's quiet routines. This was the sound of aircraft hovering, circling, searching. Maria's customer at that moment was Fatima, an elderly woman who came in every 2 weeks for a simple wash and trim that helped her maintain dignity despite her arthritic hands that could no longer manage proper hair care alone. Fatima had been talking about her grandson's upcoming wedding when the helicopter noise began, but both women fell silent, instinctively listening to determine whether the aircraft posed any immediate threat to the village. Through the salon's single window, Maria could see other villagers emerging from their homes and shops, shading their eyes against the bright sunlight as they searched the sky. The helicopters remained invisible, hidden somewhere beyond the ridgeline, but the sound suggested at least 2 aircraft, possibly more. In Maria's experience, multiple helicopters usually meant either a major operation or serious trouble, neither of which boded well for the civilians caught in between. What Maria didn't know was that 12 miles away, in a narrow canyon that provided the only viable approach to a suspected high-value target compound, a team of 8 Navy SEALs was walking into what would later be described in classified reports as a catastrophic intelligence failure. The compound they had been sent to investigate was supposed to contain 2 mid-level Taliban commanders planning attacks on coalition supply routes. Instead, it was the headquarters for a much larger group of fighters who had been expecting them. The SEALs had been inserted before dawn via fast rope from helicopters that immediately departed to avoid detection. The plan called for a quick reconnaissance of the compound, collection of intelligence materials, and extraction by the same helicopters within 4 hours. It was the type of operation these elite warriors had performed hundreds of times across multiple deployments, with equipment and training that represented the pinnacle of American military technology and expertise. But intelligence failures have a way of turning routine operations into nightmares. The compound contained not 2 Taliban commanders, but the forward element of a much larger group that had been using the location as a staging area for a major offensive. Worse, someone had provided them with detailed information about American patrol patterns and operational procedures, allowing them to prepare a sophisticated ambush that would test even the legendary skills of America's most elite special operations unit. The firefight began at dawn and continued for 3 hours before the SEALs were forced to fall back to a defensive position in a partially collapsed building that offered minimal cover but was the only viable option in terrain that provided few hiding places. By 9 in the morning, they had expended most of their ammunition, lost radio contact with their extraction helicopters, and were facing an enemy force that significantly outnumbered them and showed no signs of retreating or offering surrender terms. The team leader, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, had been in combat for over 15 years and had never encountered a situation where his team's superior training and equipment weren't sufficient to either complete the mission or extract safely. But as enemy fighters continued to pour into the canyon from multiple directions, he realized they were facing something unprecedented, a carefully planned trap that had been designed specifically to capture rather than kill American Special Operations personnel. The enemy's tactics were unlike anything Rodriguez had encountered in previous deployments. Instead of the usual frontal assaults or ambushes designed to inflict maximum casualties quickly, these fighters were using coordinated flanking maneuvers and disciplined fire control that suggested professional military training rather than typical insurgent tactics. Most concerning of all, they seemed more interested in pinning down the American team than in overrunning their position, which implied they wanted prisoners rather than bodies. By 10:30, the SEAL situation had become desperate. They were completely surrounded, nearly out of ammunition, and the extraction helicopters couldn't reach them due to heavy anti-aircraft fire from positions that had been carefully prepared in advance. Radio communications remained intermittent, making it impossible to coordinate with friendly forces or provide accurate intelligence about their situation to higher command levels. Rodriguez made the decision that would haunt him for years afterward. Rather than fight to the death and potentially allow valuable intelligence about American Special Operations procedures to die with them, he ordered his team to destroy their sensitive equipment and prepare for capture. The enemy had demonstrated both the capability and apparent intent to take them alive, and survival as prisoners offered at least some possibility of eventual rescue or escape. The capture itself was professionally executed, in a way that confirmed Rodriguez's worst fears about the level of planning and preparation his team was facing. The enemy fighters approached under cover of sustained but carefully controlled suppressing fire, used tactical communication equipment that suggested extensive training, and demonstrated familiarity with American military procedures that could only have come from significant intelligence preparation or inside information. Within minutes, the 8 SEALs found themselves stripped of weapons and equipment, blindfolded, and being marched out of the canyon toward an unknown destination. Rodriguez tried to maintain situational awareness despite the blindfold, counting steps, noting changes in terrain, and listening for any sounds that might provide clues about their location or the intentions of their captors. What he couldn't know was that their destination was a safe house located less than 2 miles from Maria's salon, in a compound that had been prepared specifically for holding high-value prisoners during the brief period before they could be moved to a more permanent location. The enemy had learned from previous experiences with American rescue operations and understood that any captured Special Operations personnel would become the target of immediate and overwhelming rescue attempts. The safe house had been chosen for its location in a populated area where American airstrikes or large-scale ground operations would risk significant civilian casualties. its proximity to multiple escape routes through mountain passes that would be difficult for conventional forces to monitor or block, and its ordinary appearance that would make it nearly impossible to identify through aerial surveillance or intelligence gathering. By noon, as Maria was finishing Fatima's haircut and wondering about the continuing helicopter activity in the distance, 8 of America's most elite warriors were being secured in a basement room less than 15 minutes' walk from her salon. Their captors were already implementing a plan that had been months in development, designed not just to hold valuable prisoners but to use them as leverage in negotiations that could reshape the balance of power in the entire region. The timing of everything that happened next would later be analyzed by military intelligence specialists trying to understand how a routine operation had gone so catastrophically wrong. But for Maria, still focused on the ordinary concerns of running her business and caring for her daughter, the real story was just beginning to unfold in ways that would test every assumption she had made about her ability to remain separate from the larger conflict surrounding her community. The afternoon brought an unusual number of customers, mostly women who were nervous about the increased military activity and wanted the comfort of familiar routines and friendly conversation. Maria found herself serving tea and providing emotional support as much as hair care, as her customers shared their concerns about what the helicopter activity might mean for their family's safety. Around 2 o'clock, her regular customer Nasreen arrived for a scheduled appointment, but seemed unusually agitated. Nasreen was married to a man who worked as a driver and translator for various groups in the region, which often gave her access to information about developing situations before most other villagers became aware of them. She waited until the salon was empty of other customers before telling Maria what she had learned. According to her husband's sources, a group of American soldiers had been captured during a failed raid, and there were rumors that they were being held somewhere in the immediate area. More concerning for the local population, both American and Afghan government forces were preparing a major search operation that could bring significant military activity directly into their village and surrounding areas. Maria listened to this information with growing unease, not because she had any particular sympathy for captured American soldiers, but because she understood that rescue operations often resulted in heavy fighting that put civilians at serious risk. Her primary concern was ensuring Layla's safety and protecting the business that represented their only source of income and security. But as the afternoon progressed and more customers shared fragments of information and speculation, Maria began to realize that the situation was developing in ways that might not allow her to remain safely on the sidelines. The compound where the Americans were reportedly being held was close enough to her salon that any rescue attempt would likely affect her directly, and the enemy forces involved were apparently large enough and well organized enough to pose a significant threat to anyone who might be perceived as supporting American operations. As evening approached and Maria prepared to close the salon for the day, she had no way of knowing that her ordinary life was about to intersect with international military operations in ways that would require her to make choices she had never imagined facing. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not just her courage, but her ability to think clearly under pressure and make split-second decisions that could determine whether some of America's most elite warriors lived or died. The helicopters continued their distant circling as darkness fell over the valley, and Maria tucked Layla into bed with stories about brave princesses and faraway kingdoms where people lived in peace. Neither of them could imagine that within hours, Maria would discover just how much courage an ordinary person could summon when faced with extraordinary circumstances that demanded impossible choices. The knock on Maria's door came at 2:15 in the morning, soft but insistent. The kind of sound that immediately signals serious trouble in a place where honest business is conducted during daylight hours. Maria had been lying awake listening to the distant sound of vehicles moving through the valley, her instincts telling her that whatever was happening was larger and more dangerous than the usual small-scale conflicts that occasionally disrupted the village's quiet routines. She approached the door carefully, her bare feet silent on the cold floor, and listened for several seconds before asking who was there. The voice that answered spoke in accented but clear Dari, identifying the speaker as someone who needed urgent help for injured men. Maria's first thought was that someone from the village had been hurt in whatever fighting was taking place in the mountains, but something in the speaker's tone suggested a more complex and potentially dangerous situation. Through the small window beside her front door, Maria could see 2 figures standing in the shadows cast by the moon. One appeared to be a local man she recognized as Khalil, who occasionally did construction work around the village, but was generally known to associate with people and activities that respectable families avoided. The other figure was harder to make out, but his posture and the way he held himself suggested someone accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. Maria's mind raced through possibilities as she considered how to respond. Refusing to open the door might anger people who could make life very difficult for her and Layla, but opening it could involve her in activities that might be even more dangerous. Her decision was made when she heard movement from Layla's room, suggesting that the conversation at the door might wake her daughter and force her to witness whatever was about to unfold. She unlocked the door slowly and opened it just wide enough to see her visitors clearly. Khalil looked nervous but determined, shifting his weight from foot to foot in a way that suggested he was being paid well enough to overcome his obvious discomfort with the situation. The man beside him was older, perhaps in his 50s, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent years in the mountains and the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The older man introduced himself simply as Commander Hassan and explained that they had injured men who needed immediate medical attention from someone with steady hands and the ability to keep quiet about what they had seen. He didn't specify the nature of the injuries or identify who the patients were, but Maria's experience reading people told her that this was not a request she could safely refuse, regardless of her personal preferences about becoming involved in whatever conflict was taking place. Hassan's tone was polite but carried an unmistakable undertone of authority that made it clear that Maria's cooperation was not really optional. He assured her that she would be well compensated for her assistance and that no harm would come to her or her daughter if she helped them with this urgent matter. The implicit threat in his words was subtle but clear enough that Maria understood the consequences of refusing would likely be severe. Against every instinct screaming at her to protect herself and Layla by staying uninvolved, Maria agreed to help. Hassan seemed pleased but not surprised by her decision, suggesting that he had already researched her background thoroughly enough to be confident that she would be willing to assist them when properly motivated. He told her to bring whatever medical supplies she had and to dress warmly for a walk in the mountain air. Maria quickly gathered the basic first aid supplies she kept for treating minor cuts and injuries that occasionally occurred in the salon, along with extra towels and anything else that might be useful for treating injured men. She left a note for Layla, explaining that she had gone to help someone who was sick and would return before morning, though she had no idea whether that promise would prove accurate or even possible to keep. The walk to the compound where Hassan was taking her proved to be shorter than Maria had expected, but more strenuous than she had prepared for. They followed a narrow path that wound through rocky terrain for about 20 minutes before arriving at what appeared to be an ordinary house that might have belonged to any prosperous farmer or small businessman in the region. Only the presence of several armed men positioned around the perimeter suggested that this was something other than a typical family residence. Hassan led her through a back entrance into a modest kitchen where several men were drinking tea and speaking in low voices about topics they stopped discussing as soon as Maria appeared. She was struck by how normal everything looked: clean dishes stacked beside the sink, a pot of rice still warm on the stove, children's drawings stuck to the wall with tape. It was exactly the kind of house where she might have been invited for dinner by a friend or customer, except for the automatic rifles leaning against the walls and the obvious tension in the air. From the kitchen, Hassan guided her down a narrow staircase into a basement that had been converted into what appeared to be a temporary medical facility. Battery-powered lights provided bright illumination, and the space had been cleaned and organized with the kind of attention to detail that suggested someone with medical training had been involved in the preparations. But what immediately captured Maria's attention were the 8 men lying on mattresses arranged along one wall of the room. Even in the artificial light of the basement, Maria could see that these were not local fighters or Afghan soldiers. Their hair was cut in military styles that she associated with Western forces. Their physical conditioning was obviously different from that of men who had grown up in the mountains, and their clothing, though they had been dressed in local garments, didn't fit properly on frames that were clearly unfamiliar with such attire. The man who appeared to be their leader was awake and alert despite obvious injuries to his left shoulder and a deep cut across his forehead that had been roughly bandaged but needed proper cleaning and stitching. His eyes met Maria's with an intensity that immediately told her this was someone accustomed to command responsibility and not comfortable with being helpless in the hands of his enemies. Hassan noticed Maria's recognition and smiled in a way that confirmed her growing understanding of exactly what kind of situation she had been drawn into. These were the American soldiers that Nasrin had mentioned, the special operations personnel whose capture had prompted all the helicopter activity she had been hearing throughout the day. She was looking at some of America's most elite warriors, and they were completely at the mercy of their captors and now, partially, at her mercy as well. The medical supplies that Hassan's men had been able to acquire were adequate for basic trauma care, but far from ideal for treating the kind of injuries these men had sustained. Maria could see that several of them had bullet wounds that needed cleaning and proper bandaging, while others showed signs of dehydration, exhaustion, and the kind of minor injuries that accumulate during extended combat operations in harsh terrain. Hassan explained that Maria's job was to stabilize the prisoners' medical condition sufficiently to keep them alive and healthy during the period before they were moved to a more permanent location. He made it clear that their value as prisoners depended on their remaining in good physical condition, which meant that providing them with adequate medical care was essential to his larger plans for using them as bargaining chips in negotiations with American and Afghan government forces. Maria understood that she was being placed in an impossible position. Providing medical care to the captured soldiers was the humane thing to do regardless of their nationality or the circumstances of their capture, but it would also be helping Hassan maintain valuable assets that he planned to use against the same forces that provided security for her village and region. Refusing to help would likely result in serious consequences for herself and Layla, but cooperating would make her complicit in activities that could have far-reaching implications she couldn't fully understand. As she knelt beside the apparent leader of the captured Americans and began cleaning the wound on his forehead, Maria found herself making eye contact with someone whose situation was as desperate as her own, despite the vastly different circumstances that had brought them both to this basement. He was clearly trying to assess whether she might be willing to help them escape, while she was trying to determine whether these men represented an opportunity to extract herself and Layla from a situation that was rapidly becoming more dangerous and complex than anything she had ever experienced. The American's eyes were intelligent and alert despite his injuries, and Maria could see him cataloging details about their location, their captors, and the physical layout of the compound with the kind of systematic attention to detail that confirmed his special operations training. He was clearly planning something, even in his current helpless condition, and Maria realized that his plans might represent either her best chance of surviving this situation or the thing most likely to get her killed. Hassan remained in the basement while Maria worked, watching her interactions with the prisoners and occasionally making comments designed to reinforce his control over the situation. He seemed confident that his plans were proceeding smoothly and that Maria's cooperation could be counted on for as long as necessary. But Maria was beginning to understand that his confidence might be misplaced and that the American soldiers she was treating were far from resigned to their fate as prisoners. As she moved from patient to patient, cleaning wounds and providing what care she could with limited supplies, Maria began to develop a clearer picture of what had happened during the failed American operation and what Hassan's group had planned for their prisoners. The soldiers had been captured during what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission, but their value as prisoners was far greater than Hassan had initially realized, which explained the elaborate preparations that had been made for holding them securely. The basement facility had clearly been prepared well in advance, with medical supplies, security arrangements, and communication equipment that suggested this was part of a larger operation rather than an opportunistic response to an unexpected success in capturing American personnel. Maria began to suspect that the intelligence failure that had led to the Americans' capture might not have been accidental, and that Hassan's group had been specifically planning to take prisoners who could be used for political and strategic advantage. As the night progressed and Maria continued treating the captured soldiers, she found herself caught between growing sympathy for their situation and increasing fear about what her own involvement in these events might mean for her future safety and that of her daughter. The Americans were clearly planning some kind of escape attempt. Hassan was obviously prepared to use lethal force to maintain control over valuable prisoners, and Maria was trapped in the middle with no clear path to safety regardless of how the situation ultimately developed. Dawn was still several hours away when Hassan informed Maria that her work was nearly finished and that she would soon be able to return home to her daughter. But the tone of his voice and the way his men had positioned themselves around the basement suggested that her involvement in these events was far from over, and that the choices she would soon be forced to make would determine not just the fate of 8 captured American soldiers, but the future of everything she had worked to build for herself and Layla in their small mountain village. The moment when everything changed forever came at 4:37 in the morning, when Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez managed to catch Maria's eye and mouth a single word that would force her to make the most difficult decision of her life: help. Maria had been finishing her treatment of the last wounded soldier, a young man who couldn't have been much older than 25, and who reminded her painfully of her late husband Ahmad, in the way he tried to maintain dignity despite obvious pain and fear. She had been carefully cleaning a bullet graze on his arm when Rodriguez, who had been watching her work with growing intensity, found his opportunity to communicate directly with the woman who might represent their only chance of survival. Hassan had stepped outside to confer with his lieutenants about the logistics of moving the prisoners to a more secure location deeper in the mountains, leaving only 2 guards in the basement. Both men were tired after a long night of standing watch, and Maria had noticed that their attention was beginning to wander as the hours passed without incident. Rodriguez had clearly been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, when the combination of fatigue and routine might create a brief window for communication with their unexpected ally. The word help carried an entire universe of meaning in the context of their situation. Rodriguez wasn't just asking Maria to continue providing medical care, he was asking her to risk everything she had built for herself and Layla by actively assisting in an escape attempt that would put her in direct opposition to Hassan and his well-armed organization. It was a request that no reasonable person would make of a civilian stranger, and no sensible person would agree to honor. But Maria had spent the past several hours watching these 8 men maintain their discipline and concern for each other despite injuries, exhaustion, and the obvious knowledge that their situation was desperate and likely to get worse. She had seen Rodriguez quietly checking on his subordinate's condition, even while dealing with his own significant injuries, and she had witnessed the way the younger soldiers looked to him for reassurance and leadership, even in their current helpless state. More importantly, she had spent enough time in the basement to understand that Hassan's plans for these prisoners involved more than just using them as bargaining chips in negotiations with American forces. She had overheard enough conversations between the guards to realize that the captured soldiers were going to be moved to a location where they would likely disappear permanently, either killed when they were no longer useful or transferred to other groups that would use them for propaganda purposes that would ultimately end in their deaths. Maria's decision to help was not based on any particular loyalty to American forces or opposition to the various groups fighting against the occupation. Her choice was simpler and more personal. She could not stand by and watch 8 men die when she had the power to potentially save them, regardless of the risks to herself. It was the same instinct that had driven her to rebuild her life after Ahmad's death, and to provide a safe haven for women in her community who needed momentary refuge from the harsh realities of their daily existence. But understanding the moral imperative to help and figuring out how to actually do so were entirely different challenges. Maria had no military training, no experience with combat situations, and no knowledge of escape and evasion techniques. What she did have was detailed knowledge of the local terrain, a clear understanding of village social dynamics, and the kind of practical intelligence that had allowed her to survive and prosper as a widow running her own business in a conservative society. Rodriguez seemed to understand her limitations and had clearly been thinking carefully about how to maximize their chances of success with minimal risk to the woman who represented their best hope of survival. When Hassan returned to the basement and announced that Maria's work was finished and she could return home, Rodriguez managed to make eye contact with her one final time and provide her with just enough information to begin developing a plan. The compound where they were being held was guarded by approximately 52 enemy fighters, according to what Rodriguez had been able to observe and overhear during their captivity. Most of these men were positioned around the perimeter and in other buildings, with only a small number actually inside the house where the prisoners were being held. The basement had 2 exits, the stairway Maria had used to enter, and a narrow window that opened at ground level behind the main building. More crucially, Rodriguez had managed to determine that Hassan's group was planning to move the prisoners before dawn the following day, which meant that any escape attempt would need to happen within the next 24 hours. After that, the soldiers would be taken to a location where rescue would be virtually impossible and escape would be out of the question. Maria left the compound with Hassan's thanks and a substantial payment for her services, but also with the knowledge that she now possessed information that could either save 8 lives or get her entire family killed. The walk back to her home gave her time to think through the impossible logistics of what Rodriguez was asking her to do, and to consider whether there was any way to help without destroying everything she had worked to build for herself and Layla. The village was still quiet when Maria reached her house, with most families sleeping peacefully through the final hours before dawn. Layla was safe in her bed, unaware that her mother had spent the night treating wounded American soldiers and was now contemplating actions that would put both their lives in serious danger. Maria sat in her kitchen, drinking tea and trying to develop a plan that might actually work, despite her complete lack of experience with the kind of operation she was considering. The first challenge was communication. Rodriguez and his men needed to know when and how any rescue attempt would unfold, but Maria had no safe way to return to the compound without raising suspicions about her motives. Hassan's men would certainly be watching for any signs that she might be planning to betray them, and any attempt to visit the compound again would likely be interpreted as evidence that she was cooperating with American or Afghan government forces. The second challenge was actually creating an opportunity for the soldiers to escape. Even if she could somehow distract the guards or create a diversion that would allow the Americans to reach the basement window Rodriguez had identified, They would still need to get past the 50-plus fighters positioned around the compound and find their way to safety through territory controlled by hostile forces. The third and perhaps most difficult challenge was ensuring that her assistance couldn't be traced back to her in a way that would result in retaliation against her family. Hassan's organization had demonstrated both the capability and willingness to use violence against anyone who opposed them, and Maria had no illusions about what would happen to her and Layla if her role in helping the Americans escape was discovered. But as Maria sat in her kitchen watching the sky lighten with the approach of dawn, she realized that she had resources and capabilities that Rodriguez and his men couldn't access on their own. Her salon was a hub of community information, which meant she knew which families in the village had relatives fighting with various armed groups and might be willing to help American soldiers in exchange for the right incentives. More importantly, her years of navigating the complex social and political dynamics of life in a conflict zone had taught her to think strategically about timing, relationships, and the careful management of information. The same skills that had allowed her to build and maintain a successful business while remaining neutral in an ongoing war might be exactly what was needed to plan and execute a successful rescue operation. The plan that began to take shape in Maria's mind was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. Instead of trying to help the soldiers escape from the compound where they were being held, she would find a way to bring help to them. The village had men who had fought with various groups over the years and who might be willing to take action against Hassan's organization if they could be convinced that doing so was in their own interest and that of their families. The key was framing the situation in terms that would appeal to local concerns rather than international politics. Hassan's group was operating in their territory without permission from village leaders, holding prisoners in a way that would inevitably draw violent retaliation from American forces, and putting the entire community at risk for the sake of their own political and financial objectives. But implementing this plan would require Maria to use her salon as a base of operations, to involve members of her community in dangerous activities they might not fully understand, and to coordinate multiple moving pieces while maintaining the appearance of normal daily routines. It would also require her to make contact with Rodriguez and his men to ensure that they were prepared to take advantage of whatever opportunity she might be able to create for them. As the sun rose over the valley and Maria prepared to open her salon for what might be the last normal day of her life, she realized that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The woman who had spent years avoiding involvement in the conflicts surrounding her community was about to become a central player in an operation that would determine whether 8 American soldiers lived or died, and whether her own family would survive the consequences of her choice to help them. The irony was not lost on her that the same hands that had spent years creating beauty and providing comfort would soon be planning an operation that might involve significant violence and would certainly put innocent people at risk. But Maria had learned during her years as a widow that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to risk everything you have built, and that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when faced with situations that demand nothing less than their absolute best. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just Maria's courage and intelligence, but the bonds of community that held her village together, and the willingness of ordinary people to take extraordinary risks for the sake of strangers who had become their responsibility through circumstances none of them had chosen or could control. The operation to rescue 8 of America's most elite soldiers began in the most unlikely place imaginable, Maria's modest hair salon, where she spent the morning of June 16th cutting hair and carefully recruiting allies, while maintaining the appearance of conducting normal business in a village that was about to become a battlefield. Maria's first customer that morning was Amina, whose husband Rashid had served with various armed groups over the past decade and was currently unemployed but known to maintain connections with men who could be motivated to take action if the compensation and justification were adequate. Maria approached the conversation carefully, beginning with general observations about the increased military activity in the area, before gradually introducing more specific concerns about how the presence of foreign fighters might affect village security. By the time Amina's appointment was finished, Maria had established that Rashid and several of his associates were indeed concerned about Hassan's group operating in their territory without consulting local leaders, and that they might be willing to take action if someone could provide them with accurate intelligence about the compound's defenses and a guarantee that their families would be protected from retaliation. Maria's second customer was Zara, whose brother-in-law had served as a translator for American forces and maintained positive feelings toward individual soldiers despite his reservations about the broader occupation. Through careful questioning, Maria learned that he had access to communication equipment that might allow him to contact American or Afghan government forces if there was sufficient justification for requesting immediate military assistance in the area. By noon, Maria had identified a potential coalition of 8 local men who might be willing to participate in an operation against Hassan's compound, and had established a communication link that could potentially summon American rescue forces to the area within hours of a successful initial assault. But she still needed to solve the most difficult challenge: getting specific tactical information to Rodriguez and his men so they could coordinate their escape attempt with the external assistance she was organizing. The solution came from an unexpected source. Layla's teacher, Mrs. Habiba, arrived for an afternoon appointment and mentioned during casual conversation that one of the women who cleaned houses in the compound where Hassan's group was staying had expressed interest in finding additional work. The woman, named Soraya, was a widow with 3 children who needed income and was known for her discretion and reliability in managing confidential household information. Maria realized that Soraya represented the perfect means of communicating with the captured soldiers. A woman arriving to clean the compound would attract no suspicion from the guards, and Hassan's group would likely welcome assistance with maintaining the facility where they were holding valuable prisoners. More importantly, Soraya had worked for families throughout the region and was trusted by everyone as someone who understood the importance of keeping quiet about what she observed in other people's homes. The recruitment of Soraya required delicate negotiation. Maria couldn't reveal the full scope of what she was planning, but she needed to ensure that the woman would be willing to carry messages to the captured Americans and report back on the compound's security arrangements. The conversation took place in Maria's salon after other customers had departed, with Soraya initially confused about why a hairdresser would be interested in the details of her cleaning work at various locations. Maria eventually explained that she was concerned about the safety of her village and needed better information about the activities of armed groups operating in the area. She offered Soraya payment that was generous enough to motivate cooperation, but not so unusual as to raise suspicions about the source of the money or the true purpose behind the information gathering. By evening, Maria had assembled a network of local allies and established a communication system that could potentially coordinate a rescue operation involving both internal escape attempts and external military assistance. But the complexity of what she was planning was becoming clear, and she understood that dozens of things could go wrong in ways that would result in the deaths of everyone involved, including innocent villagers who were being asked to risk their lives for American soldiers they had never met. The first test of Maria's improvised intelligence network came when Soraya returned from her initial cleaning visit to Hassan's compound. The information she provided was both encouraging and terrifying. The Americans were being held in the basement, as Maria already knew, but they appeared to be in better physical condition than expected and seemed to be planning something that had the guards concerned about their security arrangements. More importantly, Soraya had managed to communicate with Rodriguez during a brief moment when the guards were distracted, and had learned that the soldiers were expecting to be moved the following morning to a location deeper in the mountains where rescue would be virtually impossible. This confirmed Maria's understanding that any rescue operation would need to happen within the next 12 hours before Hassan's group departed with their valuable prisoners. Rodriguez had also provided Soraya with specific tactical information that would be crucial for coordinating an effective rescue operation. The compound's perimeter security consisted of approximately 15 guards positioned in fighting positions around the main building, with another 37 fighters housed in adjacent buildings and available for rapid response to any attack. The basement where the soldiers were being held could be accessed through either the main stairway or the window Rodriguez had identified, but both routes would require neutralizing nearby guard positions. Most critically, Rodriguez had determined that the Americans could contribute meaningfully to their own rescue if the timing could be coordinated properly. Despite their injuries and the fact that they had been disarmed, the soldiers retained their training and combat experience and could provide significant tactical advantage if external forces could create sufficient confusion to allow them to reach weapons and rejoin the fight as active participants rather than passive victims. The final element of Maria's plan fell into place when Zara's brother-in-law confirmed that he could establish communication with American forces and provide them with accurate coordinates for Hassan's compound. The timing would be crucial. Local fighters would need to initiate their assault at precisely the moment when American air and ground support could arrive to provide overwhelming firepower and prevent Hassan's group from either killing their prisoners or successfully withdrawing to their fallback positions in the mountains. Maria spent the evening of June 16th coordinating the final details of an operation that had grown far beyond anything she had imagined when she first agreed to Rodriguez's request for help. She was now planning to command a rescue operation involving local fighters, captured American soldiers, and incoming military support. Despite having no military training and no experience with combat operations beyond what she had learned from years of living in a conflict zone. The attack began at 3:15 in the morning, On June 17th, with Rashid and his associates using their knowledge of local terrain to approach Hassan's compound from directions that the guards were not expecting. Their initial assault was designed not to overrun the facility, which would have been impossible given the defenders' superior numbers and firepower, but to create enough confusion and chaos to allow the captured Americans to break free from the basement and join the fight. Maria positioned herself in a location where she could observe the compound and coordinate between the local fighters, the escaping Americans, and the incoming military support that Zara's brother-in-law had successfully summoned to the area. Her role was to manage the flow of information and ensure that all elements of the rescue operation remained synchronized, despite the confusion and violence that inevitably accompanies any combat situation. The basement breakout happened exactly as Rodriguez had planned. When explosions and gunfire erupted around the compound's perimeter, the soldiers overpowered their guards and armed themselves with weapons taken from their captors. Within minutes, 8 of America's most elite warriors were fighting their way out of the facility where they had been held prisoner, guided by intelligence that Maria's network had provided about guard positions and escape routes. The arrival of American helicopters and ground forces turned the tide of the battle decisively in favor of the rescue operation. Hassan's fighters found themselves caught between Rodriguez's escaping team, Rashid's local allies, and overwhelming firepower from aircraft that had been vectored to the target by coordinates provided through Maria's communication network. The compound that had been designed to hold valuable prisoners securely became a trap for the guards who had underestimated both the determination of their captives and the resourcefulness of an ordinary village woman. The firefight lasted less than 20 minutes from beginning to end, but those minutes contained enough violence and chaos to provide Maria with nightmares for years to come. She watched men die, heard the screams of wounded fighters, and saw her quiet mountain village transformed into a battlefield where the decisions she had made determined who lived and who died in ways that no civilian should ever have to experience. When the shooting stopped, 8 American soldiers were free. Approximately 30 of Hassan's fighters were dead or captured, and Maria found herself standing in the ruins of the compound where she had spent one night treating wounded prisoners and planning their rescue. Rodriguez approached her as medical helicopters arrived to evacuate casualties, and for a moment neither of them could find words adequate to acknowledge what they had accomplished together. The immediate aftermath of the rescue operation brought both recognition and complications that Maria had not anticipated. American military officials wanted to debrief her extensively about Hassan's organization and her knowledge of other armed groups operating in the region. Afghan government representatives were interested in her potential value as an intelligence asset who could provide information about village dynamics and local security situations. But Maria's primary concern remained the safety of her daughter and her ability to maintain the life she had built in the village where she had always lived. The rescue operation had made her a target for retaliation from any armed group sympathetic to Hassan's organization, while also marking her as someone who had proven willing to cooperate with American forces in ways that might make her a valuable asset for future operations. The recognition she received from American military officials included offers of relocation assistance that would allow her and Layla to start new lives in a safer location, possibly even in the United States itself. But Maria ultimately chose to remain in her village, using the compensation she received for her assistance to improve security for her family and to expand her salon into a larger business that could provide employment for other women in the community. The story of how a simple hairdresser had orchestrated the rescue of 8 captured SEALs never became public knowledge, classified at levels that ensured it would remain known only to the participants and the military officials who debriefed them. Maria returned to her daily routines of cutting hair and caring for her daughter, but with the knowledge that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demand nothing less than their absolute best. Rodriguez and his team completed their deployment and returned to the United States, but they maintained contact with Maria through secure communication channels that allowed them to provide ongoing support for her safety and well-being. The bonds forged during those desperate hours in Hassan's compound created relationships that transcended national boundaries and military protocols, connecting people who had shared an experience that none of them would ever forget. Maria's salon continued to serve as a gathering place for women in her community, but now it also represented something more. Proof that individual choices can matter enormously, even in situations that seem to be determined by forces far beyond ordinary people's control. Every customer who sat in Maria's chair was being served by someone who had faced impossible choices and had found the courage to risk everything for the sake of strangers who had needed her help. The legacy of the rescue operation extended far beyond the successful return of 8 soldiers to their families. Maria had demonstrated that the line between civilian and combatant is often much thinner than official categories suggest, and that the most crucial battles are sometimes fought not by professional warriors, but by ordinary people who discover that they possess resources of courage and intelligence they never knew they had. In the end, the story of Maria Santos became a classified legend within special operations communities, a reminder that the most sophisticated military training and equipment in the world sometimes depends for its effectiveness on the willingness of ordinary people to take extraordinary risks for the sake of strangers, who have become their responsibility through circumstances that none of them chose, but all of them shared.